Good morning everyone, welcome to the EduSat network. Yesterday we discussed early 20th century English literature and its features briefly. And today's discussion will take this topic further in more detail. Early 20th century English literature or modernist literature, as we may call it, has its origins in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, mainly in Europe and North America. For discussion on the same, we have with us in the studio Dr. Anand Prakash. He is a former faculty in the English department at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. Now he is the editor of Journal of Drama Studies. He also edits a magazine named Yug Paribodh. It's a Hindi magazine, and he has edited several books. It's a pleasure to have you here, sir. Welcome.
Thank you for this elaborate introduction, and Urvashi, I know that you also are a person from English literature, so that will give me good alert company, I'm sure. The topic for today's discussion is, as has been already told you, viewers, is early 20th century literature. And since we are very close to the century was there with us till 14 years ago. So we have that kind of a link, and we feel always very connected with meaningfully and significantly with this period. And the discussions therefore have to be more detailed, in the sense that we still live in that period, and we are involved in the making or in the critical analysis of the century. So that way, lots and lots of things have to be said about 20th century. For instance, as has been already said by Urvashi, 20th century continues with the 19th century. The last years of the 19th century, and there are certain things in the 19th century that became, in fact, still more crystallized in the early 20th century. We have discussed in detail some of the aspects of the 19th century earlier, and we begin today by saying that the 19th century was a very troubled century, particularly with respect to its last years. The society at that time was being stabilized around the middle of the century, but then certain tendencies emerged. For instance, in the latter half of the 19th century, there were what is called radical social movements in Europe particularly. And these social movements aroused the common masses greatly, and inspired them to intervene in the affairs of the society and the state. This happened all over Europe. In fact, there are books today available about the latter half of the 19th century where the word revolution occurs in plural. There is revolutions of 1848, revolutions of 1860, something like this. And this showed that since it was a very awake century, ideologically awake century, therefore people thought that they had to assert their individuality and their sense of freedom, and the entrenched ruling classes of the day, they would not bear with this kind of pressure that came from the common masses, because of which democratic debates which were in the social domain also started affecting literature of the period. And since we have already recounted it, I only had to mention that this trend towards the end of the 19th century ended in some kind of a deadlock, because the ruling classes then became aware that unless the tendencies of criticism, the tendencies of resistance were curbed, there would be little that they could do and keep their sway intact. Therefore, both sides became prepared to fight with each other, with the result that since the entrenched classes were strong and the rising masses were only passionate and excited, therefore some kind of a stalemate occurred neither would give in, neither would give up, and neither would be able to replace the other. So in this kind of a stalemate, what happened was that literature also didn't know which side to take and which direction to go into. For instance, I would give example of two writers who are at the polar opposites. One is Bernard Shaw. He is writing in the latter half of the 19th century, and he emerges as a very important voice in the 1880s and 1890s. And he starts with prose initially. He writes plays. He writes in his plays and in his fiction, for instance, he would be criticizing the social trends very sharply. This is one extreme that was reflected in his writing of the time, and the other extreme was Henry James, who was more psychological in his approach, and who would examine the trends from the inside of the human being with respect to his or her behavior, and he would be very reflective. He would not come out in the open and comment on the society of the time in his novels, etc. But then he would definitely assess the responses of the characters, and he would show the inner dilemmas that they had, and whether they were able to sort them out, or whether the dilemmas became still more difficult to handle. So these two extremes occurred in the 19th century, and they tell us about the trends, going their own ways and not interacting with each other, not engaging with each other. Bernard Shaw would engage in a sense, but then he would stick to his position of social criticism. This kind of a thing occurred. So what were the reasons that this kind of polarization in the latter half of the 19th century regarding ideology and society was seen? And the answer is that at that point of time, Romanticism of the earlier 19th century had become a bit tired, had lost its verve, had lost its appeal. And but W.B. Yeats, who also was around at this time, towards the end of the 19th century, and he could sometimes dream, but his dream was not as fresh as the dream of Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, etc. And he would still, would look towards the past for inspiration, and he would, that past, would be particularly evoked in the sense of myths of the country to which he belonged. He belonged to Ireland, and he would identify himself with those myths, and he would then feel happy that he had got some kind of a connect with the world in which he lived. So these writers were lost sometimes. As I said, they were tired, or they didn't look towards the world, or if they looked towards the world, that they forgot to connect the inner world of the person with the outside of the person, the world that surrounded the person. So this kind of a thing must have had certain reasons in society, certain causes in society that affected them and made them emerge in the way things happened. So let's see as to the factors that may have influenced this kind of literary response in the latter half of the 19th century, because very soon the turn of the century would occur, and these things would be further sharpened and aggravated later on. For instance, I refer to this very important phenomena of society and polity called colonialism in the second half of the 19th century. So the world, the important and the powerful nations in the world, they turn colonialist. They are not the nations are not confined to their own inner problems and pressures, but they go outside their country. They find new territories. They start controlling them. They exploit the resources of the other countries, and from there money flows back into the mother country. This is what colonialism is, and this starts in a big way in the latter half of the 19th century. So which means that partly, and this is interesting, this means that since extra money is coming from the colonies to these important European nations, therefore some of the household problems, some of the inner problems will be solved. For instance, there will not be as much misery and poverty in England, in France, in Germany, etc., as was the case in the first half of the 19th century. And since there is less poverty and there are more jobs, people who are unemployed, within the country, they can easily be sent to the colonies where they will have jobs, and then they will have a different experience of the world. Here they were poor people or the middle class people, and when they go to the colonies, then they represent the country back home and represent them as rulers. Therefore, they start tasting pleasures of a different kind. So that may have caused setting in of some kind of happiness in the country back home, and literature, which was getting its strength of passion from criticism of society, now would be weakened. So maybe that's why people like Henry James come forward and they start thinking of the inner psychological problems, moral problems, etc., the reality as it is absorbed by the individual, and how one makes sense of this reality and then feels quite happy or contented there. So this explains to some extent why the increasing prosperity of the European nations takes care of the earlier sharpness of criticism, and that's how that earlier sense of radical thinking and energy that becomes less with the passage of time. Now, till the 1880s, the colonial trends were increasing by the day, but then a new trend emerged out of colonialism, and this trend is called imperialism. There is no imperialism till 1818 or 1890, but around this time, maybe the mother country, the original the country which had planned to expand itself outside the boundaries of the country where it ruled, this ruling class starts sending out, exporting resources, economic resources, the industrial resources to the colonies there. And the machinery is set up, the establishment is done, and finally, you start making policies here, but those countries are producing goods and they are selling goods on their own, but then all the money is flowing back. This is called imperialism. So which means that, for instance, India is a kind of a colony till 1857, but after that it becomes a part of the empire, and that Queen Victoria is the emperor not merely of other countries in the world, but also of India. So that way imperialism of this kind emerges in the latter half of the 19th century. And this imperialism is like colonialism, also is of different European nations, all of them strong, all of them contending with one another. Therefore, this imperialism adds a kind of impetus to economic expansion further and control. So controlling a colony and controlling an empire are of course more or less the same, but then there is a difference in the sense that colony is controlled from outside and you simply have armies there in the colony. But under imperialism, you start establishing economic units in the other countries, and therefore a kind of administration and a kind of trade and a market center that is established, which has some kind of independence from the mother country, but it is overall controlled by the mother country. So this thing happened in the latter half of the 19th century, and as the 20th century emerges, the first few years of the 20th century, they start reflecting a kind of a crisis at the time. So you don't find many writers writing around the 1900 onwards, up to 1910, up to 1915, etc. They are all baffled as to what is happening, whether they belong to England or suppose that they go to the rest of the countries to serve the interests of their mother nation, whether they belong there. They might have certain interests which are in the new country, and they might have left their family back here, and all kinds of complexities occur. And this kind of a moral and ideological imbalance that occurs as an effect, this starts affecting the literature of the period. So should the writer then in the first few years of the 20th century continue with the traditions of the 19th century, or should they experiment new with the pressures in mind that are there in the colony and in the unit of the empire? So the form, literary form, may be different now. Earlier, one was talking about one society, but now in the 20th century, you start talking about two societies: the society where you live and the society which is under the control of the one where you live. So if somebody has a colony, somebody has some kind of a link with India, and the person is an Englishman, so to which country should the person be loyal in terms of one's connections? Should one be an Englishman completely and fully, or should one also have divided loyalties, like India after all also is inhabited by human beings and there are good people there, there are bad people in England. So what should a literature of this kind do? So I think new forms would have to be evolved then, and one very fine example of this is the writing of Conrad, and Joseph Conrad, who is writing around the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century. He starts like W.B. Yeats and others, writing in the 19th century, but then he writes a different kind of stuff and is giving a literature which is not exactly an extension of what existed in the 19th century. So Joseph Conrad is a Polish person. He had to leave his country. He came to England. He learnt English much later. He was a young man when he started learning English, and then he started writing in English. Now this is a perfect example of what was happening in the early years of the 20th century. Will this person be Polish in his attitude and in his sense of belonging, or would he be English? Or would he not be some kind of an outsider in England as he writes? And the writing of the outsider will not be the same as the writing of the person who has been born and brought up in England. And then, he would always have a sense of chasm, has a sense of, difference between where he came from and where he lived. And this is only biographical. You start thinking of his writing about, for instance, an African country or Russia or any other country, then his loyalties will be going in three different directions. He will be an Englishman because he now lives in England. He would be a Polish person because he came from there, and he's writing about Russia, and there may be some kind of a connect with Russia also. So you have a novel called Under Western Eyes, which is based on the Russian situation. You have Heart of Darkness, which is about a country in Africa. And this new kind of writing suggested that now new times had come, and literature would have to bear with pressures of this variety. So this is the problem, and this is the dilemma of the early 20th century writer, that he has to invent a kind of attitude which will help him do justice to different loyalties that one has. Can I connect it with imperialism and colonialism is the question that I ask from myself, and the answer is more or less yes, because unless a person is able to give voice to this dilemma, and because it's a real dilemma, and because this dilemma is going to affect one's writing, therefore it will be a different kind of a writing than the one that existed in the 19th century. And I referred to this earlier, the sharp divisions in society along class lines. This is what starts happening around this time. So people look at it from the class angle. If you are a poor person, if you come from a poor family, then you have your adherence to that class outlook, and you look at the society from that angle. If you are of the upper class, then of course you have all kind of prejudice and bias against the lower classes, and you will be all the time full of hatred for the lower masses. The other thing that is there, which will now have a decisive influence in the 20th century, would be that a very strong and large section of the middle class has emerged in England particularly, and in other European countries in general. And this middle class is neither the upper class nor the rich class, so it's an amalgam of both. it's born in the poor masses, and it has a kind of a ladder, that it is to climb and become the middle class. And from the middle class angle, it might start dreaming about joining the upper class, but then it is gradually pushed downwards. So where is the mooring of this class? Does it belong to the upper class because its dreams are of the upper class? Does it belong to the lower class because its roots are in the lower class? Or does it belong like a true pendulum to the middle of the place, where sometimes it swings towards the upper class and sometimes towards the lower class? And if it's having the position of a pendulum in society, then would it bother about certain things which neither the upper class nor the lower class gave attention to? So this is an important question, and in the 20th century, very soon, you will find this middle class playing a decisive role in society, in culture, and in literature. Now, I'll give an example of this from the late 19th century, but this example will hold for at least another coming 50 years, if not more, in the 20th century. And this is that the new concept will emerge in literature, and this concept is called the concept of culture. That and Matthew Arnold quite clearly explained this idea that culture belongs neither to the upper class nor to the lower class. The upper class doesn't need it, and the lower class doesn't bother about, or the opposite. The upper class does not bother about it because it doesn't suit them, and the lower class doesn't have the time to attend to this new development. So the wealth of the culture belongs more or less entirely to the middle class, says Matthew Arnold. And then he says that it is the middle class only which gives some kind of a value to literature, because literature is about values, literature is about ideas, and literature has this kind of efficacy to affect society from the middle class angle alone. So in fact, the word culture critic that was coined by writers in the 20th century, and the father of culture criticism, criticism of literature or culture from the angle of the middle class. This is what culture criticism is. The father of this culture criticism is Matthew Arnold himself. And this kind of a concept of culture continues into the 20th century, and you see that E.M. Forster, for instance, would be extending this idea of culture in the 20th century. And apart from other links, that E.M. Forster would have with England, with Europe, and with other countries like India, that only shows that it is culture that can sustain such a writer, because he should have sympathy with people who are good anywhere in the world, whether they belong to England or whether they belong to India. So the rise of the middle class and the concept of culture is one of the characteristics of the early 20th century writing this way. Now, since literature is now getting away from, inexorably, it doesn't have control over it, inexorably, it's moving in the direction of the middle class. Therefore, you will find that it's getting away, in fact, from the market, from the economy, from religion, from philosophy. All these areas of actual life, where people believe in certain concepts, believe in certain faiths, etc., and they make money and they enjoy the pleasures of life, and the pleasures of life are the pleasures of the crude kind. So one will see that people are getting away from all these things when they come to literature. So literature now is confined to the middle class, and it's talking about values mainly. So that's what the 20th century begins to indulge in. And if that is the case, then you will find that literature will not from now onwards give as much importance to social issues as it did in the 19th century. On the other side, the world doesn't bother about literature, so it will go its own way, and very soon you will realize that there will be no connect between literature on one side and society on the other.
Sir, I want to ask you a question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please go ahead.
As you already mentioned, it is the age of experimentation, modernism, and the writers are trying to experiment with new forms. And you just now mentioned that there was not so much importance given to social issues They were trying to bring about perhaps certain radical ideas also. And can it also be? Can we take the example of the Wasteland and where the characters are alien to the artist, and the artist is not trying to make so much of a connection with the reader? Is it also part of their experimentation, that they want to do something new?
Definitely, the Wasteland is a very good example, because Wasteland in fact is a wasteland because literature has lost all value for society at that time, and if there is no value, then it turns into some kind of wasteland. I'll discuss it in detail when I come to the second decade of the 20th century. But as you have rightly pointed out, this is where the literature of the time is heading. This is where it will finally crystallize itself and start appealing on a different level to the reader. So Wasteland is one example. T.S. Eliot, of course, is a modernist writer. I have not used this term modernist so far, but you have introduced it already very significantly, I say, because modernism is all this going to become. And when it's modernism, then there will be problems regarding understanding of literature from that angle. So I'll come to this later.
Okay, right.
So
thank you, sir.
Yes, this is a good input that I get from you, Urvashi, and I'll in fact deal with it a little in detail from now onwards. So the world is such at the time in the early part of the 20th century that competition is emerging, very sharp competition is emerging in the world of market, in the world of economy, and all this is the result of the rising tide of colonialism and imperialism in the latter half of the 19th century. So in fact, things are not being produced now. For the last 50-60 years from then, things have not been produced for consumption. They've been produced for the market, and they've been produced for selling. And there's a subtle distinction between, because all these things are finally consumed, but then they are being produced not for consumption but for the market and for the profits. So this is a new trend that is emerging. You can call it the capitalist trend if you like, and this capitalist trend is becoming more and more pernicious, more and more harmful for the human race, because things are not now produced for the satisfaction of human needs and wants, but for the requirements of the market. And this market is becoming very valueless in the first half of the 20th century. So valueless that very soon, within 15 years of 1.5 decades of the beginning of the 20th century, you will have a large part of the world entering into a state of conflagration or fire. It will be devastation and destruction all over the world, directly or indirectly, and the phenomena would be called the First World War. And literature is directly connected with the First World War in terms of the reality that it faced. After all, literary writers had to contend with this phenomena of a world war. This world war was different from all wars in history earlier. Most of the wars were fought for certain causes. Somebody had to be, somebody had to win territories. Some other people, had to get resources and wealth for their own country, etc. But this world war was not in pursuit of any kind of heroism, any kind of bravery, and any kind of winning of territories and things like that, but mainly and very crassly for capturing markets. So wherever the markets were, suppose the markets were somewhere near, that then the neighboring country would straight away attack it, irrespective of whether it's going to help one's own country or some other country. That will not help. So it was a grabbing for the market. It was not a grabbing for territories. It was not grabbing for a country. It was not to merely attack some country's resources, but to destroy a country's economy so that market could then be captured by you. So this kind of a very crass, very violent phenomena, that was the First World War. And human beings, the sensitive human beings like the writers, they wouldn't know what to make of it. So you have the writing, for instance, of Hemingway, who's writing about in his novels about the First World War. So there's no hero in Hemingway. In fact, there are critical books, written about Hemingway, where whether the protagonist is a hero, where the hero is fighting, the protagonist is fighting a war, is a part of the war, but then he has no dominance over the phenomena of which he is a part. So it's a new phenomena, and writers are in a way thrown away, towards the sides, towards the margins. They look from there. They feel helpless, and this helplessness also finally enters the psyche of the protagonist that the writers create in their novels. So you will find that there is a split in the writer. The writer doesn't know whether to belong to the war or to go against it. He or she is not able to understand all this. And on the other side, what the writer himself or herself thinks also enters the psyche of the protagonist, who has then to make sense of the scene captured in the novel, for instance, or in the poems. So this senseless war, this destructive war, this war that is not confined to the countries, where different countries combine, and they combine not because the peoples of the country will come together, but because the markets of the different countries will come together. So this kind of a war is totally outside the bounds of knowledge of any human being at the time. And writers, feel crestfallen. They are no more the romantic visionaries and dreamers of the earlier period, and then they stand in a corner and they helplessly watch the scene. And this kind of inertia that finally is caused by the experience of the war, this inertia becomes the theme of the writing of the time. In fact, it is here that the poem, another poem, not Wasteland, but another poem by T.S. Eliot, the Love Song of Prufrock, is more relevant. Prufrock is written just a year or 2 years before the First World War, and this poem doesn't know what love is. The protagonist doesn't know what love is. Love means some kind of affinity, some kind of relationship with another person, and because both people like each other, so it's a kind of a love song. But what kind of a love song is this, where the protagonist is not able to understand whether one has to approach the lady, and what kind of a lady is it? He doesn't know, and he is himself all the time full of doubt, etc. And the famous lines of the poem, I think, would clearly lay out the plan of the whole poem. Let's go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient, sky like a patient etherized on a table. So when the evening is being compared with the patient in a hospital, one can realize that the writer has lost all sense of moorings about love, about the proper positive theme of life, and that only such a poem about disease, about hospital, about later on the coffee cups, and in the poem there is a cat, and there is a kind of fog. All these things occur, and they have absolutely no connection with the romantic longing or the feeling for the beloved or the lover. So this kind of a poem can be visualized only in the early 20th century. It couldn't have been a poem acceptable in the 19th century, and nor would it be accepted at any time earlier in history. But then this is a new kind of poem that Eliot wrote. I think it was written in 1913 or 14, around the time the First World War begins. The writer at the time when the war is going to begin has a sense that something is going to happen, and something that will be very claustrophobic, something that will be very oppressive, that's going to happen, and the writer will become completely alienated from the surroundings to which one is supposed to belong. So this is one example of the First World War, and heroism will be taken away from the people who live at that time, and that will definitely be a very dark and a very sad day for the literature of the period. Now I come to the word modernism, because at this stage modernism is to be understood in this sense that a new world has emerged. This world has absolutely no direct vital connection with what has happened earlier in history, and it is severed all links. It itself stands alienated from the rest of the time, and people start thinking completely differently from what their counterparts were doing in the earlier centuries. So they start calling it a modern phenomena. Now, this word modern is a much abused word, as all of us know. There have been lectures, about in this program about early modern literature, and early modern literature, had the 15th century, 16th century, Shakespeare's time, 16th and 17th centuries, and all those things. So that was modern, that was early modern, and this is late modern. And this late modern is the 20th century, where modernism is supposed to be completely disconnected from history. So in fact, there is nothing like late modernism or whatever, it's only modernism. And what kind of a modernism is this? This modernism is that where the human being is alienated, where the world is on the brink of extinction. It's going to be devastated very soon, or it has already been devastated if you write, in 1918 or so. So that way, a new definition of modernism will be required now to explain the phenomena existing at the time, and all those issues and all those principles associated with modernism earlier will be set to naught, and a new kind of issue will be invented by the thinker to make sense of the current phenomena. So this is that kind of modernism. Eliot and others, they will not talk of history now. History, in fact, has already become irrelevant in the new definition of modernism. Times have become irrelevant in the new definition of modernism. And what actually, in the case of Eliot, what happens is that the medieval times are more modern, or medieval times are more modernist, because the appeal comes not from progress, not from development, not from onward movement. It comes only from those periods which were static. So far as we are concerned, which were static, in their nature, and which remained, at one point of time fixed. So that's what Eliot's emphasis in his writing seems to be, and one wonders whether this is modernism or not. There are critics who talk about modernism at length. There is that Hungarian critic called Lukács. He talks about modernism, and he talks about modernism in very negative terms. He says modernism is that which is stunted. Modernism is that which is diseased. Modernism is that which has lost all hope. Modernism is that which has only despair to look forward to. So if despair, hopelessness, alienation, if these are the modern things, then it has absolutely no link with what was associated with modernism in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries and later. So it's a very strange kind of a thing, but then there is history. Even if you deny that there is history, history asserts itself in some form or the other. And out of the womb of the First World War comes out a country which stands for hope for the rest of the world, and this country is Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia is the country which emerges as a new kind of a country and society at the end of the First World War in 1917, to be precise. And in fact, the whole world the whole capitalist world is shocked. That a socialist country can emerge in 1917 out of the war itself, away from where the war was fought. Russia was not exactly a part of. Russian armies, of course, went out to fight battles elsewhere, but Russia itself was not the country where the war happened. But then, at the back of the First World War, emerged a socialist country. Now, what is socialism as compared with capitalism that has emerged in the form of Soviet Russia? Now, this is a question that literary writers are faced with. Certain writers feel very contented and very fulfilled, that after their dreams, according to their dreams, a new country has emerged, which is the country of equality. And for instance, Bernard Shaw, who was sharply criticizing society, now can think of a country where actually all those ideas that he aspired for in his writing have finally come for fruition. And then this is a country of hope, this is a country of freedom, this is a country of equality, this is a country where the resources of the society belong to the society itself. They are not taken away by those who have money and who have privilege. In fact, all privileges also are eliminated in Russia. And a large body of Russian intellectuals, this starts supporting this new socialist system, because of which some kind of a schism occurs in the in the first few years following the end of the First World War. And the reason is that there will be a socialist lobby in Europe, in England for instance, there will be a socialist lobby, and there will also be a capitalist lobby, an anti-socialist lobby there. Very soon in 1920 for instance, there will be and a phenomenon of fascism occurring in Italy, occurring in Germany, and this will also influence the policies of countries like England and France at that time to an extent. But then what should literature do now? The 20th century literature in the first quarter of the century is faced with the choice between socialism on one side, socialism, humanism, equality on one side, and fascism on the other, where where the literature will be written by and propagated by the elites for the elites. So here you have the question of the elites, and in the rest of the world and in some parts of Europe itself, particularly in literature, you will have the writing which is devoted to freedom, equality, fraternity, etc. So this is a new contradiction, this is a new conflict that has emerged in the first quarter of the 20th century, where the two separate literary forces, two separate literary influences, that they are going to fight with each other. For instance, Bernard Shaw starts writing with a new kind of zeal, with a new kind of fervor around the time of Soviet Russia's emergence, and in a new school of thought in literature has emerged which talks about commitment. Now, what is commitment? For instance, if you ask from the angle of the 20th century, commitment in the 20th century is defined as the value of literature that makes very clear and sharp choices of good against bad, of positive against negative, and that the writer knows that this is what he or she has to do, and this is what he or she has to reject. So one is committed to humanism, one is committed to dignity of life, and for that commitment, one has to sharply define what is it that is dangerous for commitment, and what is that which is dangerous for humanism. So this thing emerges, and I talk about the counterpoint of commitment. The counterpoint is particularly emphasized by a group which is formed around this time, and this group is called the Bloomsbury Group. It's a very flashy title of the group. And to the Bloomsbury Group, people like Virginia Woolf belong, and there is James Joyce already, there is Henry James still around, and these people talk. Henry James is not a part of the Bloomsbury Group, but Virginia Woolf definitely is, and Eliot also gives his sympathy to this group, and this is basically a modernist group in the 20th century. And I'll just give in some detail the examples of the fiction of Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, because it is this fiction which symbolizes a kind of literature which is modernist and which is very clearly in favor of something that does not recognize humanism as such in the sense in which the word was accepted at the time. If you have read a James Joyce novel, then you will realize that in James Joyce there is no progression, there is no development. For instance, in novels one always followed progression. Somebody is born, somebody is young, somebody is mature, somebody finally becomes old and all. So the time moves from childhood towards maturity, and in society it moves from the beginning of one trend to the development of that trend, etc. And for instance, 1850 follows 1840, and 1860 follows 1850. So that way time moves in a certain direction. Now, so far as the writing of James Joyce is concerned, there the time either stands still or it moves in circles. So it starts from one point and then it goes in a certain direction, but then comes back. So it is a circular kind of a motion that time has. And why is it so, if I may ask? And the answer is that these people don't think that things can move, or that things should be allowed to move. They don't want them to to be visualized by people as moving in a certain direction, because that certain direction in the early 20th century is supposed to be in the direction of humanism and the direction of equality. Therefore, in the novel of in a typical novel of James Joyce, such as Ulysses, you will find that there will be a person who is all the time thinking. So he's thinking about 20 years ago, then he goes into the future and thinks about 20 years later, and then comes to the present time. So he keeps on just making circles within his mind about the time and about his experiences. So he's talking about his life when he was young, and basically the frame that is given to Ulysses is the frame of one day. So the one day of the protagonist of the novel is described in, let's say, 600 or so pages, and in those pages the writer is only thinking about the past or the future or whatever, thinks about different episodes, but then the overall driving and the controlling framework would be just one day. And the novel doesn't take place in reality, in the reality of neighborhood, in the reality of the country. It takes place in the domain of the mind of the person. That mind may have engaged in imagination with the outside world. So this is a new kind of a novel. It's called the stream of consciousness novel. It's totally given to psychology, and the character doesn't have any initiative vis-a-vis his world. The character only thinks, the character only feels within one's mind, and is seldom allowed to move out of this, because the character may go to a place and may eat something, but then in the process of eating, the person once again starts traveling back and forth in time in one's imagination. Why is James Joyce writing like this? And the same is being followed by the same principle is being followed by Virginia Woolf, who also talks of one day or at the most 1 week, etc. And there is a novel where there is a lady who is going to plan a party at home, and then she has to plan, and when she is going out to the market to buy goods, then on the way she is thinking about certain things. So maybe lots of characters, a whole portrait gallery of characters will appear in her dream, in her imagination at that time. And as the novel comes to an end, the party may happen, but more important than the party happening is her understanding of the different people that she came across and she contended with. So the question emerges as to why this kind of a writing. And I cannot straight away answer this question, except that the writer has very clear preferences for herself. The preference is that she will not talk about the actual world that surrounds her. She will only talk about the mental responses to that world, and those mental responses will give rise to other responses, and it will be a cluster of responses in the novel. But the novel will never venture into the actual domain where other things also happen. For instance, the most important thing, so far as I am concerned, it's my opinion, maybe you may not agree with me, the actual world gives us choices which affect our life radically. For instance, getting a job, reading a book, contending with people. If there is a job, then job satisfaction. If the things are becoming difficult in a country, then taking part in politics, or expressing one's opinion on politics and taking sides. All this is important. But then if one doesn't bother that these things are important, only what happens in one's mind is important, then one will write this kind of a novel. And the writer seems to have made a choice at that time that the writing has to always talk about the mental processes. Now, maybe I appear to be talking in the air, but I gave an example to counter this particular this possible response. I say when James Joyce is writing, when T.S. Eliot is writing, when Virginia Woolf is writing, the time is 1920, etc. At the same time, elsewhere in the world, let's say India, people are writing a different kind of literature. They are also post-war writers, and India was indirectly involved in the First World War. Indian soldiers went and fought on the European front, the battles of other countries like England. So India was a part of the world, unless you say that India was not a part of the world in the early 20th century. But India was a part of the world, and Indian writers at the same time were not affected by these emphases that I am talking about. They were not modernist writers. Most of the Indian writers in the early part of the 20th century were nationalist writers. They were identifying themselves with the nationalist cause, which was against the British imperialism. So imperialism is common to both England and India. England is an imperialist power, and India is the victim of the imperialist power. Whereas in England, writing is influenced by the imperialist emphases of isolation and of alienation. In India, the anti-imperialist preferences and emphases of struggling against the British imperial power, these emphases are shared by the writers. Because of which, in India, the post-First World War writers are nationalist by choice, and in order to prove their nationalism as a healthy nationalism against British imperialist interests, they think of protagonists who sacrifice, who go out and mobilize opinion, who talk about demonstrations against the British regime, and their writing is totally different from. Now, this is one example. I give another example, and this is from another part of Europe, a slightly less developed part of Europe, and that is Spain, where Pablo Neruda, for instance, is writing a different kind of poetry than Eliot was writing at the same time. They are contemporaries, but then in three different parts of the world, three different trends of writing is seen in the 20th century, and all these three different trends reflect upon the world of their time. For instance, you have the cynicism, you have the valuelessness of a First World War and the people who stood to benefit by it, from it. You have people who are victims of the First World War in different parts of the world, and all these aspirations or feelings of people from different parts of the world, that is reflected in the literature of the same period. And these literatures that I have talked about, the literature of India, the literature of Spain, the literature of England and France and other countries, all these literatures coexisted in the first quarter of the 20th century, and from here, one has to find out whether one has to take a position. One can take a position on these three different types of literatures. I'll sum it up by saying that the kind of literature that one comes across in the early part of the 20th century has these features that I've talked about, entrenched in the middle of their writings, and these trends have to be identified, have to be analyzed in such a manner that they are related to the times in which the trends occurred, and then only we will be able to make some judgment about, some assessment about the writings of the period. I believe that Urvashi, you would have something to say about what I have noted and I've shared with the viewers. So anything that you like?
Yes, sir, absolutely. And as I've been listening to you, a few ideas or maybe a question that came in my mind, and as you gave examples, clear examples of James Joyce's writing, and then you talked about Virginia Woolf's writing. Could we then say that they were trying to create an elite culture for themselves by not just an elite culture, but is it also a part of their attempt to create an elite culture by coming up with a very distinctive style of writing as modernists?
Yes, definitely. They were trying to create a culture that appealed to them. So, trying to create a culture that is elitist is one way, but elitism at that point of time seemed to appeal to them. They were genuine writers. They were writing, who had talents, who had great power of imagination,
yes,
and their writing has to be understood from that angle also. But the question is that they seem to be slightly uncritical of the times in which they lived, and their emphases reflect that uncritical understanding of those times. Maybe if these people were born in India and if they lived here and if they bore the brunt of British imperialism, they would have written like Indians. So what happens is that when at a particular time pressures work on writers, then they respond in a more or less same fashion. So European writers by and large then were baffled, and they didn't know which things were correct, and because of that reason they reflected bafflement in their writing. So you see, Virginia Woolf or James Joyce, they will not give any clear-cut answer because they don't have clear-cut answers. Maybe the situation is such in which they are caught that clear-cut answers can't be easily seen. In India, the answers are quite clear. So it's a mixed kind of a response I give. They are good writers, they write with a sense of power and inspiration, but then the First World War has taken its toll, and the middle class individuals that these writers are, they are not able to rise above the influences that work upon them. So I believe in problematizing and making the viewers ponder over these things so that more discussion is possible.
Yes. Sir, could we then say that this bafflement was also a result of the World War I and the decline of the West, this feeling that they wanted to convey through their writings that something wrong has happened, that the war should not have happened, and their whole feeling of disillusionment?
Precisely, yes. That's a good question you are raising, because after all, the human beings in the Western world suffered as much as they would have suffered anywhere else. And that human being has one part of its psyche influenced by the market forces, but there is another part of the same psyche which is affected as a human being. So both the bafflement occurs because of this, whether to go completely in acceptance of the war that is raging at the time and the values that it stands for, and the propaganda that it creates in order to become legitimate, or whether the human being will also listen to one's conscience and one's inner feelings, and then if no question is properly resolved, then only the bafflement will be shared with the reader through the writing.
Right, sir. Sir, can we also say that modernism also stood for, just as it was an age of experimentation, it also stood for adopting new technologies, say the telephone came and the radio, and with the coming of the early 20th century. But one can also say that writers like Eliot and Ezra Pound were perhaps not so much in favor of these new technologies or science.
Yes. In fact, the problem with modernism is that it doesn't take in new influences from the surroundings. It always goes inwards and it starts making one's peace there with the inner processes. But technology per se is not wrong. It becomes wrong when it's used for certain other. If it's used for destructive purposes, for instance, then it can become harmful. But technology per se it adds to the capability of the human being to create things better, take away the drudgery of the ordinary laborer. Technology has that kind of purpose. But if you start going against technology entirely, and I think this question of technology should be discussed in some detail, maybe we do it later.
Absolutely.
But there are modernist writers at the same time, like D.H. Lawrence, who go completely against technology of the period, which I think is questionable. Technology by itself is not wrong.
So yet they would call themselves modernists, not trying to adopt any modern technology.
That's the problem with these modernists of the 20th century. They are not modern in that sense. They are modern in the sense that the existing human being, the contemporary human being who is not able to understand, who is alienated, who is helpless, that human being should be captured. So the contemporary is modern for them. So they should rather talk of contemporaneity than modernity.
Right. So, sir, as we draw to the end of the lecture, I would like to say that I'm sure that all the students and the viewers found it very insightful. We found a lot of examples also, and I'm sure that you would be here on another occasion to talk more at length about 20th century literature. And I'm sure that viewers will be able to catch this lecture on YouTube as well. So thank you so much, sir, for being here, and thank you everyone for watching the lecture. Have a good day.